Every atrocity in sugar's history was a business decision, not a misunderstanding, not an accident of the era, a decision made by people who ran the numbers, weighed the options, and chose the calculation that produced the most profit. That is the thread running through 10,000 years of sugar, from the first jungle in New Guinea to the processed food lining your grocery aisle right now. And the calculation has never stopped running. Before the first crystallized grain of sugar ever reached Europe, before the first plantation was built, before the first ship crossed the Atlantic carrying human cargo, there was a plant, Saccharum officinarum, tall grass, fibrous stalk. Indigenous to the tropical lowlands of New Guinea around 8000 BC, people chewed it raw for energy. That was the full extent of it for several thousand years. No refinement, no commerce, no consequence. Just sweetness, consumed where it was found, by the people who found it. The slow migration across the Pacific brought sugarcane to the Indian subcontinent around 3500 BC, and that is where the plant stopped being a plant and became a product. Ancient Indian agriculturalists discovered you could crush the stalk, boil the juice, and let the liquid crystallize. The result was kanda, rough, brown, solid, and portable. The word will survive the civilization that coined it. It will travel west with armies and traders and eventually become the English word candy. For the first time in history, sweetness could be stored, transported, and sold. The Indian physicians who first encountered refined sugar prescribed it for headaches, digestive disorders, and sexual dysfunction. Sacred texts described it with a reverence that suggests its arrival felt like something more than agricultural innovation. What it actually was, the opening move in a transaction that would last millennia. Alexander the Great's officer Nearchus returned from the Indian campaign in 326 BC with a report that would be cited for centuries. He described a reed that produces honey without bees. The Greeks did not know what to do with this information, neither did the Romans who came after them. For nearly 1,000 years, sugar existed in the Western world as a pharmacological curiosity, locked behind apothecary counters, priced by the ounce, prescribed for ailments ranging from eye infections to melancholy. A single pound could cost a common Roman labourer the equivalent of a month's wages. This is the status sugar held for most of human history: rare, expensive, medicinal, reserved for people of significant means. That status had nothing to do with the plant itself. It had everything to do with supply. Supply is the thing that changed everything. Now, here is something that gets skipped in most accounts of sugar's history, and it matters. Between the 7th and 13th centuries, Arab chemists and traders did something that no civilization before them had managed at scale. They refined sugar to a technical standard that neither India nor the ancient world had produced. Whiter crystals, finer texture, longer shelf life, and they built an agricultural and commercial infrastructure across Persia, Egypt, and North Africa to produce it at volume. Arab scholarship perfected the mill. Arab commerce created the trade network. By the time European crusaders arrived in the Levant in 1096, a sophisticated, functioning sugar economy was already operating, with standardized refinement processes, established trade routes, and regional specialization. The Crusaders encountered this system and did what European powers would do repeatedly over the following centuries. They decided they needed to own it. Venice became the gateway. Venetian merchants bought raw sugar from the Middle East, refined it in their own operations, and sold it across the continent at markups that made the city extraordinarily wealthy. For roughly 2 centuries, Venice held something close to a monopoly on European sugar, a monopoly maintained through political relationships, naval power, and the kind of commercial ruthlessness that tends to get romanticized as entrepreneurialism. In medieval Europe, sugar functioned as a display asset. Kings commissioned sculptural centerpieces made of sugar for royal banquets, not to eat, to exhibit. The English royal household tracked sugar inventories the way modern governments track gold reserves. At Henry III's wedding feast in 1236, the crown purchased over 300 pounds of sugar for a single celebration. The sum represented more than a knight's annual income. Apothecaries kept it locked. If you could afford sugar, you were demonstrating something. If you could not afford it, you almost certainly never tasted it. This is where the calculation begins in earnest. European demand for sugar was accelerating in the 14th and 15th centuries, but supply depended on trade with the Islamic world, expensive, unreliable, and politically complicated. Sugarcane needs tropical or subtropical conditions to grow. You cannot cultivate it in England. You cannot cultivate it in France. The supply chain had a ceiling and European aristocracies were pressing against it. Portugal solved this problem in the 1400s by colonizing the Atlantic islands, Madeira, the Canary Islands, São Tomé. The climate was right, the soil was right, the labor question was the one that required a decision. Sugar cultivation is not merely demanding work. It is one of the most physically brutal agricultural processes ever developed. During harvest season, workers cut cane by hand with machetes in tropical heat, often for 18 to 20 hours a day. After cutting, the stalks had to reach the grinding mill within hours before the juice began to spoil. The mills operated continuously. Workers feeding cane into the rollers could lose fingers, hands, and arms in seconds. Plantation owners kept hatchets nearby, specifically so that a limb caught in the machinery could be severed before the body was pulled through. The boiling house where juice was processed into crystals routinely reached temperatures above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Burns from splashing molten sugar were constant. The work did not stop during harvest season. Portuguese planters tried convict labor. They tried poor Europeans under indenture contracts. Neither category of worker survived the conditions at sufficient rates to make the economics function. So the decision was made. São Tomé's sugar plantations became the testing ground for what would become the largest forced labor system in modern history. The Portuguese began importing enslaved Africans to work the cane. The calculation was explicit and documented. The cost of purchasing an enslaved person was weighed against projected productive output, and the numbers worked. When Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492 with sugarcane cuttings on his second voyage, the system was already built. It just needed new land. The Caribbean was ideal, the soil was ideal, European demand was, by this point, insatiable. The system scaled. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands each established sugar colonies across the Caribbean and South America. Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, Brazil. By the 1650s, Barbados, an island roughly the size of San Antonio, Texas, was producing more sugar than all of Brazil and was the single most valuable colony in the British Empire. More valuable than all of the North American colonies combined. The human arithmetic behind this runs as follows. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, roughly 12.5 million enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic. The majority ended up on sugar plantations. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person on a Caribbean sugar operation was 7 years after arrival. 7 years. Plantation owners calculated, and the documentation of this calculation survives, that it was cheaper to work people to death and purchase replacements than to provide conditions under which people could survive long term. The math was done. The decision was made. It was made repeatedly by men who understood exactly what they were doing. Sugar did not benefit from slavery. Sugar created the economic logic that made slavery worth doing. The transatlantic slave trade was not an accident that happened to intersect with sugar production. Sugar production was the engine that made the entire system profitable enough to sustain for 300 years. Let me explain something before we go further, because this concept changes how you read everything that comes after it. The Overton window is the range of ideas a society considers acceptable at a given moment. Economic systems, political arrangements, moral frameworks. These do not stay fixed. What can be proposed, debated, and implemented shifts across time. The reason this matters here is that the men who built the plantation system were not operating outside the Overton window of their era. They were operating at its center. The Atlantic slave trade was not a fringe activity conducted by a criminal minority. It was a mainstream commercial enterprise, financed by respected institutions, embedded in the legal structures of every major European power, and celebrated in the press of the time. Understanding this does not make the calculation less monstrous. It makes it more so. Because the same calculation, dress it differently, change the product, keep the structure, does not require a different era to repeat. By the mid-1700s, sugar was the most valuable commodity traded in the Atlantic world. More valuable than tobacco, more valuable than cotton or coffee. The so-called triangle trade moved manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Caribbean, and sugar from the Caribbean back to Europe. Every corner of the triangle was saturated with sugar money. It funded navies, it built country houses in England, and merchant fortunes in France. The average English person consumed roughly 4 pounds of sugar per year in 1700. By 1800, that number had risen to 18 pounds. This was not organic cultural drift. British merchants and politicians actively promoted sugar consumption because the colonies producing it were generating enormous wealth for the ownership class. Sweetened tea became the mechanism, cheap, palatable, warm, and perfectly suited to keep factory workers functional during 12 to 14-hour shifts without the expense of providing them actual meals. Pay attention to this moment because it matters. Sugar was not spreading through European working-class diets because it was nutritious or because workers chose it freely in a world of abundant options. Sugar was spreading because it delivered fast calories at minimal cost to people who had very limited access to food and very limited time to consume it. Industrialists understood this, the government understood this. Tariffs on sugar imports were actively reduced to keep the working class fed and productive enough to operate the machinery. The plantation system existed to supply the factory system. One form of exploitation subsidized another. On the French colony of Saint-Domingue, the territory we now call Haiti, the people the plantation system depended on reached their limit. In 1791, hundreds of thousands of enslaved workers rose up simultaneously across the colony, burned the plantations, and began a 12-year war against French, Spanish, and British military forces. By 1804, they had won. Haiti became the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. The reverberations hit every sugar power in the Atlantic world. France lost its most profitable colony overnight. Napoleon, who had built an entire American strategy around Caribbean sugar revenue, was forced to abandon it. Without Haiti's income, holding the Louisiana Territory made no financial sense. In 1803, he sold it to the United States for approximately $15 million, roughly 4 cents an acre, and the United States doubled in size. The Haitian Revolution reshaped North American geography because it destroyed the economic logic that was holding a French continental empire together. Sugar's collapse in one colony produced a political consequence that no one involved in the sugar economy had anticipated. That is how deeply embedded sugar had become in the structure of everything. Napoleon had another problem. Britain's Royal Navy was blockading French ports, cutting off access to Caribbean supply. France needed a domestic sugar source. The answer came from a German chemist named Andreas Marggraf, who had demonstrated decades earlier that European sugar beets contained sucrose chemically identical to cane sugar. Napoleon poured state resources into beet production. Tens of thousands of acres were converted across France. Research institutions were established specifically to improve yields. Cash bounties were offered to farmers who made the switch. By 1813, France was producing millions of pounds of beet sugar annually. The monopoly sugarcane had held for thousands of years. Built on tropical climate, Atlantic trade routes, and enslaved labor, was broken by a root vegetable. The competition between cane and beet drove prices down through the 19th century. Steam power accelerated production. Rail transport connected fields to refineries within hours. By the mid-1800s, sugar was cheaper than it had ever been in human history, and cheaper sugar meant more sugar in more products consumed by more people. White sugar, ultra-refined, chemically pure, became a symbol of modernity. The brown, minimally refined version was marketed as inferior, even though it was functionally the same product with trace minerals still present. Consumers learned to prefer the white. The preference was not accidental. The century ended with sugar everywhere. Jams, candies, baked goods, breakfast foods, and sweetened beverages integrated into daily life across Europe and North America in quantities that would have been unimaginable to any previous generation. The Coca-Cola Company was founded in 1886. This is the part of sugar's history you are probably most familiar with, but you may not know the specific decision that bent it. By the 1950s, internal research commissioned by major sugar companies was producing evidence of a troubling connection between high sugar consumption and cardiovascular disease. The findings were consistent and increasingly difficult to dismiss. The industry's response was not to disclose the research or modify the product. The response was to fund a counter-narrative. In 1967, the Sugar Research Foundation paid 3 Harvard scientists the equivalent of roughly $50,000 in current purchasing power to publish a literature review in the New England Journal of Medicine, one of the most authoritative scientific journals in the world. The review downplayed sugar's relationship to heart disease and redirected public attention toward dietary fat as the primary culprit. The study was not labeled as industry-funded. It was presented as independent scientific analysis. It shaped American nutritional policy for the next 30 years. The low-fat dietary movement that dominated the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, the movement that emptied fat from processed foods and replaced it with sugar to maintain palatability, was built, in significant part, on a foundation that the sugar industry had deliberately constructed and paid for. The result was an expansion of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease that the industry's own internal research had predicted. They had the data. They knew. They made a different calculation. The manipulation came to light in 2016 when researchers at the University of California, San Francisco, obtained the original Sugar Research Foundation documents. The internal papers showed exactly how the campaign had been designed and executed. The strategy was not novel. It was the same playbook the tobacco industry had used for decades. Create uncertainty, fund research that produces favorable results, attack critics through credibility challenges, delay regulation for as long as possible. The parallel is not coincidence. Some of the same consultants moved between both campaigns. While the public debate over sugar and fat was running, a new form of sweetener was entering the food supply through a side door. In the early 1970s, Japanese scientists developed a process for converting cornstarch into high-fructose corn syrup, a cheap liquid sweetener with processing advantages over cane sugar. American corn farmers were already producing far beyond domestic consumption needs, sustained by federal subsidies. High-fructose corn syrup created a new market for that surplus. By 1984, both Coca-Cola and Pepsi had switched their American formulations from cane sugar to high-fructose corn syrup. It was cheaper to produce, easier to transport, and integrated more smoothly into liquid products. Within a decade, it had replaced cane sugar across virtually the entire processed food and beverage industry in the United States. The average American was consuming more sugar than ever, and most of them had no idea the source had changed entirely or that their dietary guidelines had been shaped by an industry protecting its own revenue. Today, the average American consumes approximately 17 teaspoons of added sugar per day. The American Heart Association's recommended maximum is 6 teaspoons for women and 9 for men. We are consuming roughly double to triple the recommended amount, and we are consuming it hidden in products most people do not think of as sweet. Pasta sauce, bread, salad dressing, flavored yogurt, granola bars. An average flavored yogurt contains more sugar per ounce than a candy bar. A single can of soda exceeds an entire day's recommended intake in one drink. The health consequences are not subtle. Over 42% of American adults are currently classified as obese. Over 37 million Americans have type 2 diabetes. Another 96 million have pre-diabetes. Heart disease remains the leading cause of death in the United States. Decades of research, including the studies the industry tried to suppress, place sugar as one of the primary structural contributors. Worldwide sugar production now exceeds 180 million tons per year. The average person on Earth consumes approximately 50 pounds annually. That number continues to rise in developing countries as Western dietary patterns expand into new markets. The plant from the New Guinea jungle never stopped spreading. Some governments have begun testing instruments of resistance. Mexico introduced a soda tax in 2014. Consumption dropped by roughly 12% in the first year. The United Kingdom enacted a sugar levy in 2018, and before the tax even took effect, major beverage manufacturers reformulated their products rather than face it. Several American cities have enacted local versions. Early data suggests these taxes reduce consumption at the margins. The sugar industry has spent tens of millions of dollars lobbying against each of them. The calculation continues. The Sugar Research Foundation's 1967 campaign did not just delay regulation for a few years, it restructured the entire scientific framework through which Americans evaluated nutritional risk for 3 decades. It produced a generation of dietary guidelines, clinical recommendations, and product formulations all oriented around the wrong villain. And when the original documents were finally uncovered in 2016, when the manipulation was fully exposed and publicly reported, the structural response was essentially nothing. No criminal liability, no regulatory overhaul, no formal reckoning with the dietary guidelines that had been shaped by compromised science. The industry paid researchers to mislead the public. The public paid for it with their health. The exposure produced academic papers and journalism. And then the calculation continued. That is not the story of one industry's bad behavior. That is the story of a system that consistently produces this outcome and has not yet developed an immune response to it. The question worth sitting with is not what the sugar industry did in 1967. The question is, what does it mean that knowing what they did has produced so little structural change, and what does that tell us about who is running the same calculation in the nutritional science of right now? That question does not have a clean answer. If you are the kind of person who finds that more uncomfortable than reassuring, this channel covers stories like this every week. Subscribe, because what is coming next goes deeper into the systems most content is not willing to follow. Share this with whoever you know who still believes the low-fat movement was bad luck. They need to see the specific document trail. The next video connects this story to the pharmaceutical industry's relationship with dietary research. Specifically, how the pattern that began in 1967 got refined into a system. It picks up where this one ends. And one more thing worth putting somewhere you will find it again, the 4-step playbook: create uncertainty, fund friendly research, attack critics, delay regulation, did not originate with tobacco or sugar. It has a documented genealogy that runs backward further than most people know. That is its own video. Before you close this, the thing this video could not fully address is what a functional regulatory response to an industry that funds its own nutritional science would actually look like, what it would require structurally to prevent rather than react to. Leave your answer in the comments. Not whether you think it is possible, what it would actually require. That is a genuinely interesting answer. Write it out.